People have commented, some of the people who've criticized me that I'm an angry person, and which isn't true. But it's definitely that anger, that capacity for anger definitely is something that gives you force, and it can push, and anger definitely. So psychophysiologically, so imagine that this is obviously a thought experiment, but imagine you're chasing a cat with a broom. Well, the cat's going to run from the broom. But if you corner the cat with the broom, it will attack you, even though it's just a cat. Well, and the reason for that is that fear will facilitate either freezing or escape.
Right.
But sometimes fear isn't the right response, and anger will suppress fear. And so one of the tools that we have at our disposal psychologically is anger as an antidote to the terror that would otherwise freeze you.
If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. And so, even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter, rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now, you may think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best, at worst, this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. One of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh. But they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term. Because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can, if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the water smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away.
So I have a friend, he's a really good friend of mine, and I've known him since I was in college, and he's a tough guy. I mean, he grew up in under rather poverty-stricken circumstances in northern Alberta, really on a frontier piece of land, like it had only been broken 50 years before by his father, who was a longshoreman and an ex-military guy. Good guy, right. His father. But this guy grew up, and he is tough. He worked in lead smelters, and he wandered around Western Canada. He was my roommate when I went to college, and is still a good friend of mine. And he ended up working with like delinquents. He went into social work, oddly enough, and he ended up working with some of the worst delinquents in Canada. And he's a really good guy, and he likes to help people get better. But he isn't naive at all. And then part of the reason that he was good at working with the delinquents was because there were no tricks they could get up to that he couldn't see right through. And that was partly because he had a real integrated shadow. I mean, I'll give you an example of him. So one day, I was living in this town called Grand Prairie, and it was at the height of the oil boom. And so it was a rough town, and there were lots of rough bars in it, and lots of young men in there with plenty of money and they come in for 3 days after being out minus 40 weather working on the oil rigs, and they were ready to party, man. And we had a party one night in this kind of frat house that I went to college in, and way too many people showed up, and some of them were real troublemakers. And we had a table that was pretty full of beer bottles and vodka bottles and so forth, and one guy just went over and like tore the leg off and knocked the table over, and then a bunch of us got together and chased them all out. And this friend of mine, he said, "Oh, they'll be back." And so he went upstairs and he put on some steel-toed cowboy boots. It was just like a bloody western. He came marching down the stairs. And just as he entered the living room, there was a big knock on the front door. It was these hooligans coming back to cause grief. And he just didn't break stride. He opened the door. He pulled open the door, and there was a guy standing there ready to fight, and he kicked him underneath the chin with his steel-toed cowboy boot, knocked him right over the front porch, and the battle was on. But that was exactly what he was like,
Right.
And his shadow was integrated. He was a great roommate. He reciprocated everything. I always knew if I bought groceries one week, he'd buy it the next. Like, he was a straight shooter. You could trust him. But he was not naive, man. And that made him able to deal with delinquents and to help them. So that's part of that integration of that shadow. What you want to do with children is you want them to be forceful. You want them to have some power.
Exactly.
You want them to integrate that capacity for aggression into, well, let's say, lucid conversation. You want them to be able to stand up for themselves in family discussions. If you just punish them for being aggressive, let's say, for talking back or something like that, you don't guide that into more sophisticated development. You see this in schools too now. When my kids went to school, this was so dumb. We had a rule in our house, which was, you don't have to follow stupid rules.
That's a good rule.
But if you get caught, you have to put up with consequences. So one rule was, the school had, not only could you not throw snowballs, you couldn't make them. And so they were trying to, exactly, you should shake your head, that's for sure. It's like, because their answer, and this was all politically correct nonsense, non-competitive games. We're only going to play non-competitive games.
Yeah.
It's like, first of all, I studied Piaget.
Yeah.
A hockey game is not competitive exactly, because in a hockey game, no one brings a basketball. Everybody plays hockey. So that's cooperation. And then on the team, you have to cooperate. And like, if you're the star, but you never pass, you're just a dumb son of a bitch. You're not the star. And so there's tremendous amount of cooperation in all those competitive games. They're integrated. And this idea that, you make children better by not allowing them to be competitive.
It's disgusting.
It is. That's the Freudian devouring mother, right? That's, everyone's safe and no one's going to ever hurt anyone. And
that's kind of where a lot of young people are, they enter the world where they've been coddled, where they think that there are no winners, that everyone is, it's just win-win situations. And that's where they get really shocked by the realities of the world. So all this coddling and this idea that there doesn't have to be a winner. We don't have to get prizes for first place. Everybody should get a prize. All you're doing is setting your children up for massive, shocks when they enter the world and they see that it's not like that.
Yeah, and then they get disillusioned and depressed, or traumatized by it. I mean, when my son's hockey team in his school, they won the city championship, which was a big deal, and the school was pretty happy about that. To his credit, so was the coach. But the principal, who was this authoritarian empath, she was an awful person, I thought.
Authoritarian she said, empath? That's
empath. Yeah. She used
like
moral
that,
virtue as a club.
Yeah.
And it was, there's plenty of those people around.
And
she said, really, today we're all winners. And the coach had exactly. No, it is sickening because my son was just appalled by it. But the coach had enough guts. He said, no, the hockey team won. And it's not like the kids in the school were jealous. Some of them were, obviously, but most of them were really happy, like you are when your sports team wins, that, you know, and most people are generous enough so that they're able to celebrate someone else's victory without. And that's the same. I saw this with birthday parties. I just bloody well hated this. It's like, well, every child gets a gift bag. It's like, no, you know, they have their damn birthday. Every child doesn't need a damn gift bag. And this same naive, treacly, and it's authoritarian too, because it imposes this kind of view of the world. It's like, no, it's this kid's day to be special. That's why we're celebrating this kid. The rest of them, if they can't take that, it's like, there's something wrong with the way that they've been treated and attended to. And, you know, I had a friend who killed himself because he identified his ambition with, you know, the patriarchal force that's devouring the environment, let's say, and that's you know, the cause of historical horror. And you might say, well, no one takes that onto themselves to that degree. And that's, well, you can say that, but that you just don't know what the hell you're talking about. People take that onto themselves all the time. And then they start to identify the best part of them that strives forward with the destructive impulses of humanity. And they're so ashamed because they can't do anything good then, but in principle, you know, he tried to be as inoffensive and harmless in every possible way as he possibly could, and it just sucked all the life out of him.